Today I'm going to talk about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus was born in about 341 BC, hugely influential philosopher in the ancient world, but we don't have much of his writing in the modern era. There is some writing of Epicurus available. But there's a volume here that I have of Epicurus's writing, but if you actually inspect this book, most of it is actually dedicated to an introduction and a biography of Epicurus. There's actually not that much writing left for such a prolific writer as Epicurus. Most of what we know of Epicurus comes from historical sources and also from Lucretius, who is a Roman poet in the Republican era who summarized Epicurean philosophy in verse form for a Roman audience. So he actually used poetry to make Epicurean philosophy even more appealing to an already very keen Roman audience. Epicurean philosophy was wildly popular during the Roman Republic, as the influence of Greek culture permeated the Roman Empire. And the reason for that is, like other Hellenistic philosophies like Stoicism and like Skepticism, Epicureanism seeks to answer the question, how should I live? How do I achieve the good life? And that's something that preoccupied people in the ancient world, where life expectancy was far lower than it is in today's world. And Epicurus's answer was really surprising and actually shocking to modern ears. Epicurus advocated for hedonism, for maximizing the amount of pleasure we have and minimizing the amount of pain. And that's partly the reason why we have so little Epicurean literature left. This kind of attitude is seen as sinful, it's seen as bad during the Christian era. So Epicurus's writing was absolutely neglected by the copyists, who were reproducing reams and reams of Aristotle and Plato, but leaving out the philosopher who was actually really, really popular during his era. And that's why we have so little of that writing. Now, we misconstrue pleasure, and that's what the problem is here. Epicurus wasn't a particularly sinful or terrible person. We often associate hedonism with irresponsibility, but Epicurus certainly wasn't an irresponsible person. He was actually a very morally upstanding person. It's his idea of pleasure that we fail to understand and grasp. In the Christian era, things like sacrifice were deemed to be really important and essential for living an upstanding moral life. But that wasn't really the case during the Greco-Roman era. And the idea of pleasure here it was actually transformed as the human race evolved into the modern era. We misconstrue pleasure. We think of pleasure as something that you actively do. You actively engage in pleasure to fulfill your desires. For Epicurean philosophy, the idea was that pleasure was available to everyone as long as you're content with what you've got, as long as you recalibrate your desires to what you actually have at hand, or what is in natural abundance, like cheap food and plain water. So we associate pleasure with drinking beverages like this, like a fancy champagne. We think of, actively fulfilling our desires and stimulating our taste buds in order to attain pleasure this way. Whereas Epicurus would argue that if you recalibrate your desires and merely quench your thirst, you no longer feel thirsty So you're back to that kind of resting state of just enjoying life and being content with what you've got. You can achieve a pleasure that's akin to the pleasure felt by the gods. And what Epicurus meant by that is that the gods were seen in ancient Greek myths as capricious. They were seen as getting angry, they were seen as desiring, they were seen as lusting after things and getting tempestuous as a result of not fulfilling that wish. Epicurus actually said that if a god is all powerful, it would surely be content. Why would a god that's all powerful ever get angry, right? You would never be angry. You would be absolutely content if you were all powerful, because you wouldn't be lacking in anything. And if we recalibrate and readjust our desires to what's in abundance to us, we too can feel the kind of blissful contentment that divine beings would feel. And that is Epicurean philosophy in a nutshell. And what's at the heart of that is the concept of ataraxia. And ataraxia is a stable, even-keeled level of pleasantness that we feel when we're not perturbed. Ataraxia actually means unperturbed, if you translate it literally. So while we're thirsty, we are perturbed because we feel thirst, right? We physically have a need for water, otherwise we'd die. And as soon as we clench that thirst with what's most abundantly available, i.e. water, we no longer feel perturbed. We can reach that unperturbed state of ataraxia and feel that blissful state, reach that blissful state again. And that's why Epicurus believed that the life of pleasure doesn't lie in lusting and desiring after fancy things like champagne, and actually being content with a simple glass of water. Cheers.